It's March 2002, the opening round of that year's Formula One World Championship. We're in Melbourne, Australia, and we're smack bang in the middle of the period of time where Ferrari and Michael Schumacher dominated the sport, where Schumi would qualify on or near the pole position, take the lead by turn 1, and lead all of us to question what the hell we were going to do for the next 2 hours, provided his car didn't blow up. And with rumours that their new car, the F2002, was to be even faster this year, it left the opposition shaking like a dog crapping acorns. But for the first couple of rounds at least, they'd be using last year's car, so the opposition might still be a factor. At that time, the two closest teams to Ferrari were Williams and McLaren. Saying that sentence in 2023 defies any modicum of belief, but hey, these were different times. They were good times. Both teams had equally potent combinations. McLaren had David Coulthard, fast and reliable enough, provided his machinery didn't hang him out to dry. And in the other seat was Kimi Raikkonen, in his second year of Formula One, and promoted quite quickly after proving what he could do in a Sauber during his debut last year. They were the only team carrying Mercedes-Benz engines back then, and it had been a happy marriage whilst they were together. But when it comes to engines, Williams had BMW, maybe the fastest engines Formula One had, aside from maybe Honda, and whatever was used to power Alan Jones's mouth. That team's drivers were Michael Schumacher's box-headed brother Ralph, who was a plenty decent driver, and the other was the formidable Juan Pablo Montoya. He may not have won a Formula One World Championship, but don't be fooled, people. Don't be fooled. Other interesting things heading into the season? Well, there were some. Alain Prost's team failed to make the grid after running out of money and French support, which at this stage, Alain was kind of getting used to. At least his cars weren't burned outside his house this time. But there were still plenty of teams left on that grid, with a few of them giving some drivers their debuts. Sauber gave Felipe Massa a shot. The newly formed Toyota team brought in Alan McNeish. Jordan, who was starting to run out of coin, gave Takuma Sato his chance. But the one that everyone had eyes for in Melbourne was the local boy, Mark Webber. He had a more than decent junior career and was the first F1 driver from Australia since David Brabham in 1994. Despite the euphoria surrounding his debut, the fact was this: he was driving a Minardi, a team that had permanent residency on the last row of the grid. It was a very bad car, and the team didn't even have the resources to fight the food truck parked out back. Never mind Ferrari, who, once again, took out the front row in qualifying. In fact, that qualifying session seemed a tad ominous, even if qualifying was slightly different back then. But hey, anything can happen in Formula One, and it usually does. For example, both of the Arrows cars decided to lose all their electricity before the race even began, which for a team desperately in need of cash and results was not so helpful. They pushed their cars back to the pits and even had a crew member stranded on the grid as the cars were about to queue up for the start. The Ferraris may have been up front, but Ralf Schumacher was in a good position. He got a good jump, sailed past his brother, and was flying. Literally. That was a big crash. But while Ralph and Rubens were busy conducting flying lessons between each other, the pack behind them decided to one-up their crash by destroying each other. Something about these pictures seems decidedly unhealthy. Along with Ralph and Rubens, Fisichella was out, as was Massa, and Heidfeld, and Button, and Panis, and McNeish. Couple that with the two Arrows dumping their electricity on the grid. That meant that almost half the grid was dead before the second corner. It meant that the Jaguars who qualified at the very back were now up to P5 and P6. The Minardis were up there too. David Coulthard was leading the race, Michael Schumacher was down in fourth, Raikkonen dropped his keys in the footwell, just chaos. Insanity. Madness. When the war zone was cleared up and the race got underway, it was Coulthard leading from Jarno Trulli, Montoya, and Michael Schumacher. Eddie Irvine in the Jaguar clearly had his mind set on his yacht and left a 10,000-mile gap to the pack ahead. Not that it would have really mattered much. Them Jaguars were slower than a sloth in mud. The real battle was up ahead with Trulli, Montoya, and Schumacher. Well, make that just Trulli and Schumacher. That may have been an easy pass for Schumacher, but he was now faced with the task of having to pass Trulli, which was by no means an easy feat. Throughout his career, Jarno Trulli gained a reputation for forming what would be known as the Trulli train. He beat the crap out of everyone in qualifying, setting down some awe-inspiring laps, but come race day, he couldn't cope speed-wise, held everyone up, and formed a train of cars behind him, creating one complete ribbon of hell for all those foolhardy enough not to qualify well. Schumi may have been a 4-time world champion at this point, but this seemed a step too far for any mortal human being. No matter how close he got, no matter how much faster he was, no matter how much Ferrari meant to Italy, Jarno truly didn't care. He really was the first Italian born to put the pride of Italia in second place. For now, he wanted the dub, and this worked well until Trulli encountered his biggest enemy, himself. What made this crash more impressive was that back then, these cars had traction control. You can't even be mad at that point, especially given it was later revealed that he had spun on some oil. Not too much he really could have done about that. Someone who would have been mad, apart from the sleep-deprived Renault mechanics, would have been David Coulthard. He pulled out a 7-second gap, but because the safety car came out, all that was obliterated, bunching the field right up. Wait, what the hell? Why is the arrows of Enrique Benaldi out there in the spare car? He's not allowed out there. Sure enough, it didn't take long for the stewards to figure that out. He was disqualified from the race, leaving the fate of the Arrows team in Heinz-Harald Frenzen's hands. But he was disqualified earlier after passing a red light at the end of the pit lane. He might have felt stupid, but it was nothing compared to Coulthard, who took an unscheduled lawn mowing venture before the race got back underway again. He fell down the order, and now Montoya was all over the back of Schumacher. Heading down into turn 1, he takes him on the outside. Beautiful move. Granted, that BMW engine was a freaking rocket, but still, this was but a sliver of why people loved Montoya in Formula 1. It was similar to what he did in Brazil the year prior. The dude was mustard. Montoya was now leading, Schumacher second, and Irvine in that god-awful Jaguar was third. For about 13 seconds, before the McLaren of Kimi Räikkönen scythed on through, Iceman wanting to prove to the world why he was a worthy successor to Mika Häkkinen, that he can be the next Finnish Formula 1 world champion. Up front, the battle went on. Montoya versus Schumacher, two insanely talented drivers going at it hammer and tongs. Montoya had talent and a BMW engine behind him, but Schumi had a bit more than that. The Ferrari had more downforce, but also he was clever, cunning, and at some times a little bit too aggressive. He knew he had to get past Montoya, partially because he wanted the win, but also because the McLarens were getting closer and closer and closer. On lap 17, he performed the switchback and passed Montoya for the lead. This was racing, but it presented a little bit of a problem. Michael Schumacher was now leading the race with a fast car. Ah, crap, that's it. Game over. Behind him, Sato's race was over due to Eddie Jordan spending 30p on electronics. Coulthard was still mowing lawns, although that was more down to his gearbox going on strike, and Jacques Villeneuve's rear wing vacated the car and gave him quite a sizable crash. And what all of this meant was that in 5th place was hometown boy Mark Webber, driving a Minardi he was running in the points. An impossibility, even if they were the only cars running in the race. Yet, here he was, potentially getting points on debut in the worst car on that grid. And after 33 laps, Coulthard's gearbox finally had enough and was vindictive even in death, breaking down on the most awkward part of the racetrack, making DC the most miserable Scotsman in the entire world. The gargling gearbox in that McLaren was music to the ears of Mark Webber as he came in for his pit stop. It was exactly what he needed. What he would not need is, say, a 30-second pit stop, which would delay him and potentially throw him down the order. Luckily, he didn't get that. It was a 35-second pit stop. Issues with the fuel filler cap meant he was thrown into the clutches of his teammate Alex Young, but he wouldn't be the threat. Instead, Mika Salo in the Toyota started to rein him in, and there were still 20 laps to go. Up the front, Schumi just put in lap after lap and just drew away from everyone else. Same old shit. A trend that would be oh so familiar to anyone watching Formula 1 in the early 2000s. Not that I'm complaining about it, but it did basically mean that the race was now for second, Montoya or Räikkönen. Both of whom were being trounced in lap time by Pedro de la Rosa and the other Jaguar who was 5 laps down. Why exactly the greatest driver never to be considered great was in this scenario was beyond anyone's comprehension. Although he was way down on the cars ahead of him, he was effectively stuck where he was. And with Schumacher a mile ahead and the Montoya-Räikkönen battle stabilizing, the cameras began to focus on the driver in 5th. With a handful of laps to go, Mark Webber was holding position. but only just. His traction control was trying to run away from him, and he had lost 7th gear. That made his worst car on the grid even worse. And back in these times, points were only dished out to the top 6 drivers. And despite the fact that Minardi were a team that thought points only existed in fairy tales, they knew they had to make this count, because every point matters. If Webber got 2 points instead of 1, it could potentially rake in $25 million in prize money at the end of the year, and maybe make this team live to see another day. So, team owner Paul Stoddart, who was also an Aussie, said to Webber in no uncertain terms, "Do not let him past." The him he was referring to was Mika Salo, who was drawing closer and closer, until eventually, with 3 laps to go, he was right on him. Martin Brundle reckoned it was game over, and I think everyone else did too. Webber, however, decided, nah mate, not happening. He defended with all his might, but it really did seem that resistance was useless. With 2 laps to go, Salo spun. The crowd rejoiced. Those there trackside say that it was the one time that the crowd was louder than those deafening V10 engines. Up the front, Schumacher took another victory to start off the season. Montoya was second, Raikkonen was third, Irvine somehow got his Jaguar into a place that it had no right to be in, and sometime after they crossed the line, came Webber. Advanced Australia Fair, you've done it boy. Fair dinkum. Although it must be said, Salo got mighty close to Webber before he crossed the line. All that gesturing and celebrating almost pulled off a Bjorn Wertheim there. But who cares? The worst car on the grid got points. 2 points maybe, but 2 crucial points at that. And it was just a great performance from a rookie who had the weight of the world on his shoulders. Well, it kind of seemed that way. The occasion was such that Webber and Stoddart had an impromptu podium celebration after the race, which they would be fined 50,000 euros for, but everyone knew that the hassle was worth it. The whole moment was worth it. People were scaling the catch fences to celebrate what was a great day in Aussie motorsport. And it all came after attrition, disqualification, madness, brilliance, and resistance against a Panasonic billboard. This was the craziest Australian Grand Prix ever, but it was also one of the very best.